Chance, from acid rap to now, his content it's different. Fans have noticed that. Chance rapped the ABCs in a verse recently. That's what I mean.
Oh, I love my wife. I love my wife.
I want you to be aware of your business, know whether you're in a 360 or not. I want you to appreciate the culture that changed your life and took you from college dorm rooms eating noodles and noodles.
Chill.
Yeah. Kendrick, you can fool them. Can't fool me, dog.
Yo, what are y'all talking about? These ain't like us.
What's up?
Yeah, that's so.
Lobberies and gentlegrams, before the battle begun between the tiny Tupac twin and Sandra Suing's son, the one who spun a ton of verbal guns and done the fun of the fruity phony Montana dumb defamation drizzler was none other than Joe Budden. See, Joe Budden has been a visionary in countless different facets of his own career and his prediction of the careers of his peers throughout the years.
I study
Rapaholics
for a living.
Nowadays, content creator and musician can be looked at as synonymous. You have guys like Playboi Max or DDG who are full-time streamers making most of their income from the content they produce, but that content lies on the backbone of the music they create. Even further than that, you have artists like 6ix9ine, T Grizzly, T-Pain who have made full resurgences in popularity and garnered brand new audiences within the new generation, not by necessarily making new compelling music, but making content. And then on the highest level, it seems like rappers who are at the later stage of their careers, perhaps even retiring, carve an exit plan that's centered around creating their own podcast or radio show. Look at Nicki Minaj with Queen Radio. And yes, I know, Barb, she's nowhere close to retiring, but there's no doubting she carved out a whole new avenue for herself when she got on the mic in a different way. Look at Nori with his Drink Champs podcast, or even Fat Joe and Jadakiss, who are putting out podcast episodes in 2025 that on a bad day would likely perform better from a viewership perspective than any music they could put out in 2025.
Ask me a question. How do you deal with hate? Please, can you ask me?
How do you deal with hate, brother?
I don't.
But when you think of rapper gone content creator, no name is more synonymous to the term than Joe Budden. I mean, his entire network and conglomerate of podcasting is literally called the Joe Budden Network.
Jesus Christ.
And to this day, aside from sponsorship deals, ad revenue, licensing deals, merch, just his Patreon alone, his exclusive content on there is generating him over $1 million a month. But it was a long climb up to the top to get to this point, and for a while, Joe was subject to a slew of horrible contracts, people taking advantage of him from a business perspective, and people disrespecting his credibility, chalking him up to a simple retired rapper who was hating on everybody doing their thing.
Spicy.
But that couldn't be further from the truth, and throughout this journey that Joe has been on, he was ultimately the one who made it the standard that a rapper can not only be fully embraced as a podcaster, but also make massive amounts of money doing so. But things definitely look dark at the beginning. Before we go into how Joe predicted a lot of where the media landscape would be today in 2025 through his own podcast, we have to look at a separate vision he had that could have turned out to be the biggest thing in hip-hop if Joe didn't follow his vision and instead allowed himself to continue to be taken advantage of.
All right, we have guests, right?
No.
Around 2016, Joe realized that his best days of rapping were behind him, and he did what most rappers do, but don't usually follow through with, and that's retire. And yes, we'll get to a period of time where Joe most definitely wasn't retired and made a lot of predictions on what we'd see transpire with La Brianna, but we'll look at that later in this video, because right now I'm talking about everyday struggle. The concept of having one veteran rapper who's seen it all, done it all, knows the secrets of the industry, and has an old school perspective on the culture, debating with a modern internet personality who's just as controversial but completely opposite in his music takes, his music taste, and his taste in Big Macs. And that's Big Mac a snack a diddler.
Those 3 Big Macs are for me. Them 2 big ass fries for me.
The internet and music as a whole had never really seen this type of debate style show where two guys on the complete opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of perspective, experience, taste, etc. would go head to head to debate the current climate within hip hop. And before the show kicked off, Joe gave his thoughts on what the vision or the goal for the show would be. He said, "Rap Twitter usually deals with things on a very surface level. We are going to peel the layers back. Akademiks is going to give me every single thought from a consumer perspective, and I'm going to crap on all of it because I hate consumers." And that's exactly what Joe did on this show. If you watch tons of clips from the Everyday Struggle days, you realize how many of his takes aged amazingly, not just because he might have looked at things from a more mature lens than Snackadiddler, but because he looked at things from an outside lens of the consumer, from someone who has lived and breathed the music industry and seen the best and worst aspects of it.
Stop reporting on street shit. The street shit will escalate to a point where you're not going to report on it. And you can't report on it. What else?
Take, for example, their 10-year anniversary debate on the massive sales battle between Kanye West and 50 Cent. The way Joe frames this, it actually has a lot of parallels to the beef between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. Akademiks is first up to give his thoughts on the sales battle between Kanye and 50, and he basically says this is like a passing of the torch moment. 50 Cent was dominating hip-hop at the time, but when Kanye West outsold him, it marked not just a shift in who was the biggest rapper in the game, but also the type of sounds and subject matter that was most dominant. 50 had that gangster persona. He was putting out singles like I Get Money. Meanwhile, Kanye West was putting out singles like Wait Till I Get My Money Right. Yeah, he was braggadocious in his own right, but he was the more vulnerable underdog in the situation. And his success at the top ushered in a much more introspective, emotional crop of artists like a Drake, Kid Cudi, J. Cole, etc.
Spicy.
And that sales battle was a pivotal moment in shifting the tides, right? That's, at least from a consumer perspective, what we would have thought of the entire thing. And that's what Akademiks had said. But Joe Budden had countered it to say that this was bigger than just two rappers going head to head and the consumers picking who they thought the top guy at the moment was. This was a calculated effort from the record label that owned both these two artists' catalogs, Universal Music Group. Does that label ring a bell? Huh? Joe says UMG was sick of 50 Cent's antics, sick of him doing whatever he wanted and getting away with it because he was the highest selling artist at the time. They manufactured this head-to-head and led Kanye West out on top because he was the artist that at the time they felt like they could control. Sounds funny in 2025, but in 2007, Kanye West was the industry darling compared to 50 Cent.
Every 4 or 5 years in music, the sound changes, right? When this was happening, we couldn't figure out why this was even a competition. Anybody with a brain could tell you that 50 was going to sell more. That was just the time in 2007. Kanye West was who he was. He wasn't this person yet. This was not a competition. This is label orchestrated. This is manufactured. This is Universal saying we have had enough of 50 Cent and his arrogance. We have had enough of this dominant man just kind of doing whatever he wanted to do, as it had to do with Universal / Interscope. Now, Def Jam, Kanye West, they are Universal. 50, Interscope, they are Universal. Why would Universal make this humongous rollout marketing plan for two of their own artists, pitting them against one another? Solely because of 50. When Kanye won this matchup, it allotted for people like you to feel exactly like you just said you felt. Kanye was making great music. This is when he made the jump. And from the jump, he never looked back. And from the jump, 50 wasn't able to progress in music.
And this really offers a much more in-depth look at the mechanics of the music industry and how these shifts in the sound can feel natural to the everyday consumer, but really they're more calculated than ever. And we saw the same thing play out in the battle between Drake and Kendrick, who, like 50 Cent and Kanye West, were both under UMG, just different record label divisions in that same label. With Kanye, he was under Def Jam, that was owned by Universal. 50 Cent was under Interscope, which was owned by Universal. And in this Kendrick and Drake beef, Kendrick was under Interscope, again, owned by UMG. And Drake was under Republic, another record label owned by UMG.
I study
UMG
for a living.
We've gone through the situation a million times. A key factor to Drake's lawsuit against UMG was that he knew he was coming up for contract renegotiations with them. He just finished a $400 million contract, allegedly, and he felt like they purposely smeared him by putting the machine and all the resources behind Kendrick in that battle so that he would come out on top and the tides would turn in terms of who was the top guy. Now, I think in both cases, it was easy for both Kanye and Kendrick to come out as the underdog who won their respective battles because, frankly, they were both putting out the better music, right? Not like us, Euphoria, that was way better than any diss Drake released. Graduation was a way better album than 50 Cent's Curtis at the time. So because of that, it was very easy for the record labels to make this shift feel natural while manipulating who would be at the top for their own benefit. And this is something Joe Budden had said over 8 years ago today. And that's not all. We all know the infamous meltdown he had when Lil Yachty was a guest on the show. At the time, Yachty was hotter than ever with multi-million-dollar brand deals with massive companies like Nautica. He was gearing up to drop his debut album. And at the root of Joe's rage was him just being a concerned artist, telling another fellow artist to make sure he had his business in order for when all of that hype died down. He was asking Yachty if he knew he was in a 360 deal, and Yachty didn't know. And that's what made Joe go over the edge.
Tell me what you want from hip-hop.
I don't know.
You don't think that's a question you should answer at some point?
We're making music, bro. I'm just having fun.
You're gonna have a big problem with just asking.
Yeah,
you
what do you
don't
want
sound
to
like
make
you
sense?
very aware with what's going on, and you one of the hottest niggas on earth. I want you to be aware of your business, know whether you're in a 360 or not. I want you to appreciate the culture that changed your life and took you from college dorm room eating noodles and noodles.
Chill.
Yeah.
But that rage was justified because that debut album that Yachty was gearing up to drop, it didn't perform so well. It sold around 40,000 copies in the first week, which was very underwhelming at the time. If Yachty's business wasn't in order, like Joe had been asking, he could have been stuck in a horrible contract, failing to recoup the advance that he received, forcing to pay back the labels for a long period of time. Take that from Joe Budden, who, similar to Lil Yachty, hotter than ever with his first single, Pump It Up, but failed to one-up the momentum he had early on in his career as his career progressed. And because of that, he saw an uglier side to the industry when an artist is stuck in limbo in a contract they don't want to be in. Again, he was giving these perspectives not as a consumer of the music, but instead as someone who's experienced the other side of it. But it wasn't just the business aspect of the music that Joe Budden had offered advice on and as a result predicted a lot of outcomes for. At the time, Akademiks was the voice of the next generation. The SoundCloud rappers, the mumble rappers, any rapper you would see on a Rolling Loud lineup in 2017. He was friends with them, he would stream with them, he'd post them on his Instagram page, and one of them who got himself into a lot of trouble was XXXTENTACION. One day on the Everyday Struggle show, Joe and Akademiks were reviewing a clip of XXX getting into an altercation with the Migos. And Joe, knowing how Akademiks operates, capitalizing off a lot of this controversy without carefully dissecting it and offering valuable advice that can help these people avoid the conflict instead of fueling it, Joe went on a very long rant about how when these guys get in trouble and Akademiks is commenting on it, he's directly responsible for fanning the flames, and therefore, whatever transpires from these conflicts, you could point a slight finger at Snacka Diddler. And beyond that, he sent out a grave warning to XXX that handling these fights the way he is, running to the internet to escalate the conflict without being connected to the proper protection, will lead him in a very compromised position.
When I watch these XXX clips, I hear your name. This is snitching, number one. We would never know a word about this if he didn't tell us. Migos get into this type of shit every other week. We never see a video. Know why? Because behind all of the young hip-hop people, some of them have OGs behind them, some of them don't. Know where Migos falls on this list? They do. Because he's gonna get beat up in LA for some shit that he said. X. There is a street protocol, and if you are not a street, you should mind your business. There's no OG to say, knock it off, relax. When that little behaves that way, you move.
And they feel like you profiting off posting stuff like that financially and getting monetary gain. So like you aiding and assisting the bullshit.
And sadly, what they discuss in this clip would parallel the series of events that transpired just about a year later that would tragically take the life of XXX. No security, walking around, not scared of any confrontation. It was Joe's exact words that would parallel a situation that took XXX's life. And there were countless other examples of Joe Budden predicting a multitude of things throughout his little tenure on the Everyday Struggles show. From making Akademiks do 100 push-ups after he lost a bet that Kendrick would sell more than 500,000 copies in the first week with his album Damn at the time, to warning Chance the Rapper that he was deceiving his fans and would likely lose a lot of the love he had from the public if he continued fabricating his story and his music. Joe was clowning the extra soft, Charmin, Sesame Street type raps that Chance the Rapper was producing in 2017 after the massive success he had with his album Coloring Book. Chance was headed in a very family-friendly direction, which is okay and all, but you can't forget what his fans loved him for to begin with. That was the gritty, unpolished, immensely vulnerable raps that we saw on Acid Rap. But by late 2017, Chance had turned into this polished caricature of his former self. And on top of that, building his entire brand around the fact that he was independent when he wasn't truly fully that. And things hit a boiling point, and Joe's words were fully manifested into reality just about 2 years later when Chance the Rapper finally released his massive debut album, The Big Day, which basically became a meme of how jolly and happy he was for loving his wife, and was really looked at as one of the worst or biggest fumbles for a project of all time.
Ooh, I love my wife. I love my wife. Ah!
And all the criticisms fans had for that project were the exact same thing Joe had said 2 years prior when Chance was still on top of the world and there were only a few very small signs that this was the direction he may have been headed in.
Chance, from acid rap to now, his content it's different. Fans have noticed that. The difference in content and the marketing machine at work. I think I am used by artists to negate the growing consensus amongst their core fans. Chance rapped the ABCs in a verse recently. That's what I mean. You are not independent. Stop saying it and stop responding to me every time I say it because I'm willing to prove my points.
But now you might be asking yourself, even though yes, Joe Budden turned into the poster child of a quote-unquote hater, all because of the words that he spoke on this show, which a lot of them would later become true. Ultimately, the show was a massive success, launching Snackadiddler into a whole other stratosphere and allowing Joe Budden to successfully pivot from a retired rapper to a flourishing content creator. So you might think, at the time, it'd be the dumbest decision in the world to stop that ball from continuing to roll, right? Well, that's exactly what Joe did. About 8 months after the show had started, Joe Budden abruptly quit. The world was confused. Yeah, he had his podcast, but where the numbers were really being pulled in for him at the time was on Everyday Struggle. It'd be like Lil Wayne quitting rap after the Carter 3, or Kanye quitting after he just beat 50 Cent in that sales battle. It made no sense, but Joe was insistent on leaving that show and taking full ownership of the content he produced. His reasons for leaving after a measly 8 months were very simple. In an interview with Akademiks years later, he said, "Do us right. I'm never going to be in there yelling and screaming so that Joe can be done right. I've been homeless. I'll be fine. I'm fighting for Complex to do the right thing by us, the people who made the show. Think about our place in those shows and what it was delivering, and what it could potentially deliver if you ever got the ad side of this show right. Now think about what you were being paid, what I was being paid, what the mic and sound people were being paid. I was getting $22,000 a month, $19 a month after I paid Ian. The next cycle, I wanted it to double. When my contract was up, I wanted $50,000 a month. They came back and said something like $40,000. I said 40. They couldn't bump it up that 10,000 more.
Because in my plan, either everybody going to get paid or you going to get paid. And that's what happened when I left. They have all the rights to these shows. And that's where Joe's business relationship always gets a little bumpy. Because I come in and I'm a success. And then you see how much of a success it is. And then you want the rights to other things. And Joe says no every time.
Obviously, that showed Joe that they had no interest as treating him as anything more than just an employee. So Joe completely rebuilt his platform, his own platform, from scratch. And by making the bold move of leaving that show at the height of its popularity, he really predicted the outcome of how both him and Akademiks' careers would go once they decided to finally go independent. Yeah, $50,000 a month is a big ask. And then you also got to pay Akademiks, Nadeska, all the people who worked on the show. That was a lot of money for Complex to dish out. But think about 2025. Joe's own podcast right now is earning just off Patreon alone $1 million a month. And Everyday Struggle as a TV show had so much more potential than Joe Budden's own podcast did. If they continued that run, think about how much money that show could have been bringing in. Joe Budden was asking them for $50,000 a month. They wouldn't pay him that. Now his own show that he owns makes $1 million a month just from one stream of income, the Patreon. By refusing to compromise and fighting for his ownership in the content he produced, Joe Budden would end up going from making around $19,000 a month off of Everyday Struggle to probably making anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 a month after all expenses are covered for with his own Joe Budden podcast right now in 2025. His own Joe Budden podcast.
Just too good. It's just too good.
And I really want you guys to put this into perspective. It's kind of interesting to think about the money side of all this stuff. I don't know how the Spotify numbers work. I mean, obviously his podcast is on there as well. I don't know what they pay out. But just off YouTube alone, the Joe Budden YouTube account is pulling in about 10 million views per month. That's around $100,000 in just ad revenue alone. Again, that's not off the sponsorship money they make, off the Patreon money they make, which is over $1 million a month allegedly. Think about the type of money Complex could have had if they kept Everyday Struggle on the air and just paid Joe Budden that 50 grand that he wanted per month. But the financial hardships wouldn't stop with Joe leaving Everyday Struggle. Leaving the show allowed Joe to put all his attention towards building up his own podcast, the Joe Budden Podcast with Rory and Mal. By 2018, the show was a massive success, which allowed them to enter an exclusive partnership deal with Spotify that reportedly paid them less than $2 million annually and granted Joe no ad revenue share or ownership stake in Spotify. And yeah, that's a good deal, right? I mean, he was asking Complex for $50,000 a month for Everyday Struggle. Now he's doing about $180,000 a month with Spotify. Great. But he's not making any money off the ads that are played on Spotify when you watch the podcast, and he has no actual ownership in the platform. So everything he's building up, he just gets a paycheck at the end of the day. It's a big paycheck, but a paycheck nonetheless. He's still kind of working almost as an employee under Spotify. So ultimately by 2020, he exited his Spotify deal, stating that Spotify never actually cared about the podcast individually. They only cared about Joe Budden's contributions to the platform. AKA, Spotify didn't care about the podcast's growth. They didn't care about compensating the people on the podcast properly. They just cared about what having that podcast exclusively on Spotify meant to the actual growth of Spotify. And he also accused Spotify of pillaging the audience from the podcast, aka they just paid the Joe Budden podcast to be on Spotify so that everyone who listened to the Joe Budden podcast would later go on to listen to other podcasts that were already on Spotify. They didn't have the best interest of Joe Budden or his work as a priority. And he said after countless negotiations with them, they refused any reasonable bonus structures for the members of the Joe Budden podcast and didn't offer them any ownership. So ultimately, he split up with them.
What does the partnership matter if they get paid in perpetuity off everything? You can't just stitch whatever you want into the feed whenever you feel like it.
Any kind of ad they wanted to.
Anything they want at any time. Just plug it in. Y'all do what y'all do and then just give it to us. No. And come off of YouTube. Give us all the video. And don't show up nowhere else. They just asked for a lot. This is our shit. We gonna figure out how to run this. It was a lot wrong. I don't lose a day of sleep saying no to that.
And you might be thinking he's at the root of these problems, right? He's the one that keeps leaving these situations. But it's only when he realizes and ultimately predicts that his best interest is served when he goes independent. And of course, now again, he has 70,000 paying subscribers on Patreon, making the network, the Joe Budden Network, one of the highest earning creator-run podcasts on Patreon, and they're doing over $1 million a month. And it's that mentality Joe Budden had that would reflect into how a lot of other major podcasts would handle their business going forward. Snack a Diddler himself had a podcast with Spotify, but he ended up shifting his focus back onto his independently owned content platforms like his live streams, his Instagram channels, his Twitch, his YouTube, etc.
Those 3 Big Macs are for me.
Joe Rogan was the highest earner on Spotify, but even he's no longer exclusive on Spotify. The Joe Rogan Experience, his podcast, became exclusive to Spotify in 2020, but when they renewed his contract in February of 2024, which was reportedly worth around $250 million, they removed the exclusivity clause, allowing him to distribute his podcasts on other platforms as well, like YouTube and Apple Podcasts, allowing him to generate new forms of income from his own content and not be tied strictly to Spotify. And this shift reflects exactly what Joe Budden had warned about years earlier when he criticized Spotify's platform-first approach. Joe argued that locking creators into a single platform would limit their reach, undervalue their work, and ultimately prove unsustainable. His prediction has since played out across the industry. Aside from the biggest podcasts in the industry, the Joe Rogan podcast or Snackadiddler's podcast, you also have shows like Last Podcast on the Left that left Spotify's exclusivity clause in 2021, and they cited how the model of keeping their content exclusive to Spotify hurt their growth and their monetization. There were other reports that revealed that some podcasts that were only exclusive on Spotify had lost more than 3/4 of their audience by only allowing listeners to hear it on Spotify. And as a result, Spotify themselves have now shifted away from that exclusivity model that they were working with in favor of broader distribution and ad revenue. In essence, they realized in the short term, yes, it might benefit the Spotify platform itself if they have all these massive podcasts that you can only hear on Spotify. But in the long term, all of these podcasts would now have smaller audiences because you could only listen to it on Spotify, which obviously wouldn't be in the best interests of the individual podcasts themselves and would hurt Spotify down the road because these podcasts would have less of an impact, less of an audience. So in essence, Joe Budden's early criticisms of Spotify's ownership-heavy strategy very accurately foreshadowed the unraveling of the exclusivity model across the board for many major podcasts. So now we've seen Joe Budden critique artists, we've seen him critique major corporations like Spotify, but there was one, I don't even want to call him an artist, let's call him an entity. A massive entity that Joe Budden went at when he first built up his podcast. It didn't even have a name at the time. He was calling the podcast, I'll name this podcast later. And the first major moment Joe had on his podcast that predicted the entire trajectory of Drake's career going forward was Joe's criticisms on Drake's album Views. Back in 2016, Drake is fresh off his battle with Meek Mill, back to back. He was obviously the unanimous winner, but at what cost? Well, it left a little bit of a chink, or a massive chink, in his armor when it came to the fact that the entire world now knew he did not write his own raps. Now, this is a bit of a rabbit hole here, but stick with me. In my Quentin Miller documentary, now that we looked at that situation 10 years after it happened, I showed you guys how Drake was taking some subtle shots at Jay-Z all throughout that beef with Meek Mill. Once on the song Charged Up, where he said, I got me a deal with Apple and I still feel entitled, because of course Tidal was Jay-Z's streaming platform, which Drake rejected a deal with to instead sign with Apple Music, to which he was a pioneer in dropping the first Apple Music exclusive album, which was none other than Views, which Joe Budden was critiquing, but we'll get to that shortly. Drake also sent shots at Jay-Z on the song 30 for 30, where he reflected on the Meek Mill beef, rapping, not really sure what more you expected when the higher-ups all come together as a collective with conspiracies to end my run and send me a message. Now, a couple years after that song would release, Drake was reflecting on the beef in an interview. And again, I touched on this in depth in my Quentin Miller documentary. Maybe I'll leave a link for that in the description of this video. But in that interview, Drake had said that the reason why the Quentin Miller reference tracks ended up getting leaked out is not actually because of Meek Mill. While it was Meek Mill who premiered the diss tracks with Funkmaster Flex on the night that he released his diss track aimed at Drake, wanna know, it was actually, according to Drake, a quote-unquote higher up who had pressured DJ Drama into giving Meek Mill the reference tracks so he could release them on the same night that he put out his diss track against Drake so that he would unanimously win this beef. Again, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but Drake here is saying that DJ Drama was pressured by a higher up who said, you know, our guy Meek Mill, it's not looking too good for him right now. Back to back is destroying him. We need something. We need those reference tracks that are sure to put the final nail in the coffin in this battle. And that's when DJ Drama ended up giving up the reference tracks, allegedly, right? Who could that higher up be? Well, it was Meek Mill, who was signed under Jay-Z's Rock Nation management company. while this beef with Drake was going down. In the first diss track Drake released throughout the beef, again he references the fact that he still has love for his idols, but he's taking the high road and he still feels entitled, making reference to the deal with Tidal that he rejected, Jay-Z's deal. Jay-Z again is managing Meek Mill. Years later, Drake alludes to the fact that there was a quote-unquote higher up who pressured DJ Drama to give Meek Mill the reference tracks to use when he was dissing Drake. The higher-ups conspiring to end his run and send him a message. Now, why is this all important? Well, because when Views came out, it was actually supposed to have a Jay-Z feature on the song Pop Style with Kanye West. When the album came out, that Jay-Z feature was nowhere to be found. And Joe Budden, amidst his critiques of the Views album, which we'll touch on, he also insinuates that there's a massive shift overall within the music business that's going down, and it involves both Drake and Jay-Z.
Here's a point. I believe, this is only my belief, that he was sent to distract that man Drake.
I think it was addressed on the 30 for 30 freestyle. You and I were the only two people at first that said 30 for 30 freestyle is not about Meek, that is about Jay-Z.
Yes, Rory.
Joe couldn't put a finger on it just yet, because again, this information didn't come to light until years later, but Joe was sensing that there was some sort of rift there, and they were both battling to have a massive stake in the future of music, which would ultimately be streaming. Jay-Z kind of lost that battle because Tidal didn't end up becoming what he thought it would. Meanwhile, again, Drake inked a successful deal with Apple Music and became the platform's highest streaming artist. Kanye West, months after this Joe Budden rant, would go on stage at one of his Life of Pablo tour stops and say that it was Jay-Z who removed both his own and Kanye's verse from Drake's album due to some beef between Meek Mill, Apple Music, and Tidal. Pretty much confirming all the pieces to the puzzle of that quote-unquote higher up that was conspiring to end Drake's run that he was insinuating, and the comments that Joe Budden would make when he was prefacing how he felt Drake sounded defeated and uninspired on that Views album.
His cause is bigger than that. Because him, and Hov at the top. Whatever those two niggas are fighting about, whatever Drake, Hov, and I'm going to say Dre and Ivine too, whatever the niggas at the top of music know is coming, they're preparing for it. And if you love music, you better prepare for it too. There's a trickle-down effect occurring now.
So Joe Budden's already seen the signs and shifts of the industry, but ultimately it was his critiques of that Views album overall that I think would only resonate with Drake's music more and more as time progressed. For me, I was actually a big Drake fan before that album Views had dropped. Yes, it sucked to know that my favorite Drake project, if you're reading this is too late, was barely written by him, but I thought for the most part he put a lot of effort into the production, the introspection, the subject matter behind his projects up until Views. For me, Views was the turning point. This is when I saw an artist compromise their artistic integrity in favor of a formula that would maximize their capital. It was ever since Views that we saw Drake go in this pop lane, dumb down his music more and more, devalue every single project he released afterwards, and what was it all for the sake of? The sake of getting those streaming numbers up. The more bloated the project, the bigger the track list, the more formulaic the songs sound, the more profits go right into his pocket. But at what cost? Not much, just your legacy.
I think that kid on that album that I heard sounds real uninspired. I think that music is real good. You can fool the people that are not paying attention. That music sounds good and I enjoy it. 40, you sound amazing. 40 continues to progress. Drake, you do not.
So you see how exactly what Joe's saying here would go on to pan out in terms of Drake's entire career, right? 40 would continue to progress on the production side. Drake would continue to regress in terms of lyricism, subject matter, and innovation as a whole. And Joe would emphasize that he missed the days where Drake would start the trends instead of being the one to hop on them.
I miss the Drake that starts the waves, not hops on other waves. And I'll say it again. I miss Drake that pushes the agenda, not let the agenda push him. Big difference between a Drake and a Hov while they both at the top.
Tell me what you have learned about Drake from Take Care to now.
For a nigga that is crowned king of introspection, he's been at the top of this music game for years. What has he told you different from Take Care to this album?
So this was a really long-winded rant before the days of Joe being, I guess you could say, a more refined podcaster. His thoughts were kind of all over the place, but again, he predicts a lot of what we would see with Drake's career for the next 10 years after this podcast released. He's asking you important questions. What have you learned from Drake from Take Care up until the Views album? Absolutely nothing. For someone who was crowned the king of introspection, for someone who was wearing that crown that Joe Budden believed the last person before him wore was Jay-Z, he had very big shoes to fill, a very important voice to bring forward, and he used it to churn out a bunch of unenthusiastic, generic pop records for the sake of appeasing the industry. Again, like Joe had insinuated, there was a massive shift and battle going on between the higher-ups at these corporations where Drake was at the forefront of, and it's possible because of the deals he took, he was forced to go in this lane where he would again give us these 20-plus song projects year after year. Literally every year after he signed that Apple Music deal, we got a new Drake album, each one sounding more formulaic and less inspired than the last one, and each one having a larger track list than the last one, perfectly geared to running up the streaming numbers. And while Joe has been less harsh of his critiques on views over the last few years, I guess based off how it's aged, what he says here resonates completely into what we saw Drake's career transpire into. He didn't become Jay-Z. He became a manufactured pop star. And I could do an entire video where we break down all of the Joe Budden diss tracks that came after this, everything he predicted there, and everything he actually said in this 1 hour and a half monologue of a podcast that he did when Views just came out, because there was a lot of other things he predicted. He was questioning why Drake was so harsh on certain street rappers like a Meek Mill, but then seemed to desperately cling on to Future sound, his lingo, his production, and everything that came with Future. Because again, Drake went from being the guy who started the waves to now having to hop on them and cling on to them. And we know how that aged after, his collaboration with 21 Savage, after Not Like Us, you run to Atlanta when you need a check balance. And he also emphasized how important Drake, Kendrick Lamar, and J. Cole's voices were for this generation, again comparing Drake continuously to Jay-Z, and stating that with this massive lack of innovation and inspiration within Drake's subject matter, how is he going to be a positive voice for the next generation? Not just in terms of the people listening to him and the message they take from his music, but also in terms of the blueprint he was building for the next crop of artists after him to model their careers after. Joe was emphasizing with a Jay-Z, even with all the pressures of being at the top, he never let that compromise the integrity of his art. With Drake, from one project to the next, everything became more watered down. And if you look at the landscape of his offsprings today, you could see that their music sounds just as uninspired as his did. That Views collaboration with Apple Music, the whole agenda of the streaming platforms as a whole, with Drake's Views album being at the forefront of that, or being the frontliner of that streaming movement, it's created a landscape where artists are incentivized to compromise lyricism in favor of half-baked melodies, viral TikTok sound bites, repetitive hooks, and bloated track lists. Joe Budden warned him in 2016, "You have the torch right now, your voice is important. Everything you rapped about wanting on So Far Gone, you now have that. What are you going to do with that voice?" Now, of course, all of these critiques led Drake to send a little subliminal Joe's way on the song No Shopping with French Montana. He rapped, "Pump it up, I'm not a one-hit wonder, they know all my stuff." It's ironic because Joe was literally critiquing him, not for being a worse artist than Joe, but actually being much greater than Joe and having a lot more potential than Joe ever did, and to just not fumble that by chasing these formulaic hits. So everything Joe was critiquing Drake on, Drake pretty much delusionally embodied on his response to Joe. But what's insane, and again, I could do a separate video where we break down every single diss track from the Joe Budden and Drake beef, is that Joe Budden would unleash like 4 massive diss tracks, ripping into every aspect of Drake, predicting a lot of what was to come from his career, a lot of questions that Pusha T and Kendrick would then go on to ask in their separate diss tracks against Drake, and really unravel this blueprint that all of Drake's ops would use in the future of how to dissect the very character of this pop star. And the one thing I want to focus on, because again, we could do a separate video where we focus on the intricacies of Joe's diss tracks, but the one little critique that he had, remember when Kendrick rapped, "Let your core audience stomach that, then tell them where you get your abs from"? Yeah, that was Joe Budden predicting that entire thing.
Well, check it out. Now, in the case of Joe Budden and Drake, I think it's just going to be a rap battle, or it's going to stay on wax if it really is a rap battle, because we saw Drake actually send some shots and Joe Budden respond 3 times. Now, Joe Budden has actually added additional information because it seems like he's dying to get more responses out of Drake, and it seems that Drake is paying attention because Drake actually responded to what he said on a podcast. Now, Joe Budden is making a crazy accusation. It might be true, but it's an accusation where I'm like, yo, pardon? Come again? Now, Listen, if you didn't hear his last diss song, go check it out on latenightcreep.com. It's called Afraid, but he mentioned something about Drake having or kind of changing himself to now have a sculpted stomach. Now, I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe he's trying to say that Drake was better before he started working out. He was actually talking about Drake kind of getting some surgery done to kind of erase fat or somehow getting a quote-unquote sculpted stomach. Now, Bossum actually tweeted at Joe Budden and said, yo, why did Joe fire those shots at Drake's sculpted stomach? Why did you do that, Joe? Now Joe responded by saying, cause he saw Dr. Miami and he ain't even tell y'all. Hip-hop is weird now. There ain't no way a goddamn rapper would be going under the knife or going to get liposuction at Dr. Miami. That's really meant for Instagram bitches, not no goddamn rapper. Another fan tweeted at him on another day and they said, Joe, you're irrelevant when it comes to beefing with Drake. And Joe Budden responds, irrelevant rappers is better or are better than rappers who get lipo twice. Now, this is the part of hip-hop I don't even want to go down.
Now, ultimately, what inspired me to do this video was actually a video by another creator who I highly suggest you guys check out. He's one of my favorite YouTubers right now. His channel is called Geek About It. I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video to his channel, but he did a video on how Joe Budden basically predicted Not Like Us and the entire beef between Drake and Kendrick, amongst several other things. And it made me go down a rabbit hole to realize there was a whole hell of a lot that Joe Budden had predicted, but I'd like to take a look at what he had to say with you guys, because Joe Budden really had the foresight to realize that this battle was bound to happen years before it actually did.
Kendrick, you could fool them, can't fool me, dog.
Yo, what are y'all talking about? These ain't like us.
The Grammy goes to Not Like Us, Kendrick Lamar.
Like Nostradamus, Joe Budden has predicted oddly specific things that would happen in hip-hop years before they occurred.
I think if you hit Drake too hard, he gonna cry.
Drake, he's going ahead and filed a lawsuit for Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us.
Joe Budden's biggest I told you so moments came with the Kendrick Lamar and Drake beef. 3 years before the Like That verse, he had already called it.
I'm telling you something, I've been saying it for years. They have to address each other.
You think it's gonna really happen?
Why would they do it though? Because you have to. The two niggas tell me a time in where it hasn't happened, where the two dudes at the top don't talk to each other. They have to.
Not only did he predict that these two giants would eventually go head to head, he even described how it would happen and how Drake would be defeated.
Man, if Kendrick and Drake make us wait till 2030 to get whatever the they about to do.
Like y'all avoid each other because y'all operate in different spaces, but y'all keep bumping into each other artistically because y'all are that great. You cannot do it.
But at that point, it sounded like a stretch.
Kendrick, you could fool them, can't fool me, dog. Been in this game for years. You can't trick me, you such a student, dog.
He was convinced Kendrick still had that fire, that primal competitive instinct every real MC has.
It's a stone cold killer on the loose that been quiet for years.
Kendrick could play all this coy shit he want. He is an animal, threat to society.
To everyone else, that ship had sailed, but Joe Budden didn't buy it.
I still don't see this head-to-head Armageddon shit that you keep trying to predict, you keep trying to will to happen.
This is happening. Armageddon is here.
And what do you know? First-person shooter drops.
Y'all are never getting what you were talking about, that face-off. It's never happening.
And Joe says only one person gotta get mad for this to happen.
And that person was Kendrick. What's funny is he had also warned them to never take their eyes off of him.
I don't know when he's coming, but I know he's inserting himself. He's inserting himself in this. And Drake, you better look at him. He not coming to play with you. Hey Cole, he heard your album.
And when you look back, it's insane how over the years, how many times Joe Budden kept emphasizing that this battle was absolutely inevitable. Even though the landscape seemed less competitive than ever, with Cole and Labrie hugging on stage, Kendrick Lamar being quiet, on a hiatus, focusing more on developing Baby Keem, his cousin, as an artist, and his label PG Lang than actually releasing music of his own. When Joe Budden reacted to the Family Ties song between Baby Keem and Kendrick Lamar, he emphasized that whole sequence that Kendrick did, Smoking on Your Top 5 Tonight, that was him showing Drake, or at least warning Drake, that he was on the lookout. He was coming for that throne. When Drake and Cole did First Person Shooter, Joe was right there again, emphasizing how Kendrick must have been watching that in disgust. The exact way that Kendrick Lamar responded to First Person Shooter and popped out to kick off this battle in full effect with his verse on Like That was exactly what Joe Budden had been saying years before this on his podcast. And for some reason, what's crazy is before Rapaholics was ever really a thing, about a month before, Kendrick Lamar had released his verse on Like That, proclaiming F the Big Three, it's just Big Me, I was watching the Joe Budden podcast, and I don't know what prompted me to take a screenshot of this comment. As you could see, the date of this screenshot is February 28th, 2024, about a month before Kendrick would say F the Big Three, it's just Big Me, and whoever this guy is, Censure120, said, Kendrick is chilling. J. Cole is amazing, but there's levels to this. Nobody wants Kendrick Lamar to act up again. Enjoy the peace. Now, Joe Budden must have been talking about something related to Kendrick feeling away about first-person shooter and J. Cole and Drake hugging and kissing on stage, because what else would prompt this guy to comment this unless Joe Budden was already talking about how the beast in Kendrick Lamar, the boogeyman, was about to be awakened once again. And it just blows my mind that this comment was typed a month before Kendrick would shake up the entire game at levels we had never seen before, predicting all of this just a month before.
Up to Like That hit number 1, Kanye and others started inserting themselves into the drama. Rick Ross dropped a diss track and Kanye made a Like That remix, promising Kendrick he'd help him take out Drake and J. Cole.
I did do this Like That remix though. I think that's what you was wanting to lead into. Shit. Let me see.
You know we had to get the hooligans up here. We gonna take the... Yo, Dot, I got you.
And believe it or not, Joe predicted that too.
I need for Kanye to move out of the way. It's Kendrick Drake. Kanye move. Justin LeBoy move. You guys have to stop.
Before Kendrick even responded to anything Drake said, Joe had already called his next move. He'd go after that one thing Drake couldn't defend. The uncomfortable rumors that have followed him for years.
No, I'm tired of niggas telling me to shut the f up. Every time I'm telling you where some killer conscious nigga's brain is gonna go if you keep playing with that right Bobby, person. Joe, whatever that little girl name, that is weird.
I love him. You know, we just texted each other the other day and he was like, I miss you so much. I was like, I miss you more.
I think if you hit Drake too hard, he gonna cry.
Drake is bringing legal action against Universal Music Group as a result of Lamar's track Not Like Us, alleging they artificially inflated the popularity of Lamar's track. That is so culturally clueless.
Cole, I don't think is just prepared for these lights to be this bright.
They're not battle tested.
These lights are too
I'm not checking.
bright.
Past 2 days felt terrible. Like, it let me know how good I've been sleeping for the past 10 years.
And in a moment that feels almost supernatural, while talking about how Kendrick couldn't fool him, Joe casually said the name of what would become the biggest song in the entire beef, a full 3 years before it ever existed, almost like a prophecy.
Kendrick, you can't trick me. You such a student, dog.
Yo, what are y'all talking about? These niggas ain't like us.
How? Hold on, bro. How?
So, I mean, yeah, from the disses that Kendrick Lamar would use, not just the ones that Joe said on his podcast, like, hey, when you hit Drake, you're going to end up talking about that Millie Bobby Brown stuff. That's going to be too harsh for him. He won't know how to take it. But Joe also gave Kendrick a bunch of ammo from his own diss tracks against Drake 10 years prior, when he was talking about the Lipo, talking about the Ghostwriters, talking about the OV Host Sweatshop and Party Next Door getting his record stolen by Drake. He predicted Drake suing. He predicted J. Cole dropping out of the battle. And the craziest part of all is, before Kendrick Lamar ever even responded to First Person Shooter, Joe Budden was critiquing the very album that First Person Shooter was on, For All the Dogs, saying that Drake needs to start hanging around women his own age. Leave these younger women alone. The exact ammo Kendrick Lamar would use in the biggest diss record off this battle. The very same thing that Drake would egg Kendrick on to talk about in Tailor Made Freestyle, rapping, talk about him liking young girls, that's a gift from me. And where did he hear that from? I heard it on the Budden podcast. It's gotta be true. Drake knew that these shots were coming from an opponent who knew him the best and studied the game to the highest degree. Joe Budden, whose words, whether they were from 2024 all the way back to 2015, had trickled down to predict the exact series of events that we'd see play out all across the music industry. Whether it was business deals, rap beefs, or just music as a whole, Joe Budden's analytical sense of thinking, stripping the consumer aspect out of his thought process, out of his approach, out of his predictions, and instead speaking like a calculated industry insider, had foreshadowed some of the most insane moments we've seen in music over the last decade. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you in the next one.
I study
Rapaholics
for a living.